Okay, it being 7 p.m., I'm going to call to order the August 28th, 2019 meeting of the City of Kingston Heritage Area Commission. My name is Hayes Clement. I'm the chairman. We'll introduce other commissioners shortly. A few housekeeping items. If you need to use the restroom, there are restrooms this way. Please silence all cell phones. Please keep any outside conversations that aren't germane to the topic at hand to yourselves, or go out into the hall with those, and please respect other applicants. Now we're going to do the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. I think it'd be helpful, since we have a new commissioner, Bernie Matthews, welcome Bernie, that we all go around and introduce ourselves, the commissioners. Again, my name is Hayes Clement.
Abigail Robin.
Kevin McAvoy, Dean Barnes, Doug Freeland, Bernie Matthews.
Kyla.
Julie Edelson Stafford, Preservation Administrator.
Now is the time, as we do every month, where we have an open comment period. How many folks would like to speak tonight? If you could sort of keep it to maybe 5 minutes, if that's possible. Note that this is going to be the only time that the public's going to be able to comment on something. If you're not an applicant, but you wish to comment on any of the proposals before the commission, this is your chance. You're not going to have a chance after something's presented. Tanya, do you want to go first? Just and state your name and your address.
Tanya Garment, 102 Word Street. I think that you guys need to turn on your microphones too.
There you go.
I'm reading this on behalf of Marissa Marvelli. To the members of the Heritage Area Commission, in regards to the application to replace 24 windows at 23 and 27 West Strand. The West Strand is arguably the most striking architectural assemblage in Kingston. It continues to be a remarkable testament to the city's once thriving waterfront commerce. It was for these reasons that the preservation of the West Strand was an early focus of Kingston's landmarks and heritage area programs. A defining feature of these circa 1870 Italianate facades is the historic arched windows. Replacing them with squared units and cladding the arches is wholly inappropriate. Such a change would negatively impact the architectural integrity of the row and greatly compromise its character. The Kingston Urban Cultural Park Plan, which underpins the work of this commission, specifically calls for the city, quote, calls for the city/commission to impose additional controls within these historic districts, which require that rehabilitation of all buildings shall be done in accordance with the Secretary of the Interior's standards for rehabilitation. And then it's cited here. I'll give you this. I'll submit this. Standard number 6, deterioration features will be repaired rather than replaced. When the severity of deterioration requires replacement of a distinctive feature, the new feature will match the old in design, color, texture, and where possible materials. Unlike modern windows, old wood windows are designed to be taken apart and repaired. It is why they can last so long. Common issues like broken glass, failing glazing, deteriorated wood, and missing weather stripping are easily repairable and can drastically improve the energy efficiency of the units. Almost done here. The cost associated with window restoration is competitive with that of replacements, and the work has great integrity. Emily Major of White Clay Kill Preservation is a window restoration specialist active in the Kingston area. She offers free consultations. Emily at whiteclaykillpreservation.com. Given the iconic nature of the West Strand It is imperative that the Commission promote a strong preservation ethic as it renders its advisory opinion on this application. Sincerely, Marissa Marvelli, 60 Noon Lane, Kingston, New York.
Thank you. Giovanna, you want to speak?
Hello. I know that the commissioners are all familiar with the Kingston...
Giovanna, if you could state your name and
Oh,
address.
sorry. Giovanna Regini, Ward 5, Fair Street. I know that the commissioners are all familiar with the Kingston Urban Cultural Park Draft Management Plan, which serves as the original basis for the Heritage Area Commission's advisory work. Tonight, I'm here to put a reminder of it on the public record. As you review tonight's materials, the HAC should have a clear understanding of the responsibility of its advisory role in structuring comments for the HLPC. Per the Preservation Plan approach in Part 5, page 28, the Review Board is clearly laid out as follows. Quote, "One of the most potent tools in promoting preservation is architectural and design review. The areas identified above, which include the Stockade District and West Strand, will be placed under the jurisdiction of the HLPC, the city's existing preservation-oriented board. Standards and procedures set forth in the local laws establishing this commission and creating the Stockade Historic and Architectural Design District will be applied to these areas, as will applicable provisions in the recently adopted city zoning law and preservation standards established by the Secretary of the Interior. Continued under preservation standards and guidelines in Part 5, page 35, the zoning ordinance is noted as establishing preservation standards, guidelines, and procedures within the city's historic districts. Applicable portions of the revised zoning ordinance require Landmark Commission review and approval of all applications for any changes made within these districts, including construction, reconstruction, alteration, restoration, removal, demolition, or painting. These requirements apply to all buildings, structures, outbuildings, walls, fences, steps, topographical fixtures, earthworks, landscaping, paving, and signs. It goes on to describe requirements imposed by the ordinance pertaining to all aspects of compatibility with existing and adjacent architecture and character. Quote, "In short, every conceivable element of significance and compatibility," end quote. And so, also in short, if it is in a historic district, design review decisions are the purview of the HLPC. While the HAC can and should make comments, it should also make sure to clearly defer final decisions to the HLPC. Thank you all for your consideration and for giving me the time to comment.
Thank you, Giovanna. Anyone else would like to comment publicly? First item of business tonight is the adoption of minutes from our July 24th meeting. Did everyone get a chance to review those? Anyone have any issues or questions, suggested changes? Do I hear a motion to adopt the minutes as presented of our July 24th, 2019 meeting? Dean, do I hear a second? Bernie? I'll call for the vote. All in favor? Aye. Anybody opposed? Thank you. Next item of business is 9 to 17 and 21 North Front Street and 31 Schwink Drive, otherwise known as the Kingstonian development. We're going to hear tonight a presentation by the project's architect. I want to just reiterate to the commission that our role in reviewing this at this point is advisory, as was pointed out in the public comments. We are primarily concerned with the visual impact study at this point and what the architects are going to present. This is your chance. It won't be the last chance, but this is definitely a critical chance for us to weigh in with any concerns we have to the developers and whatnot. We are not likely to come to a written opinion with our advisory opinion tonight. We can do that probably next month, but we do need to start deliberating on that. Anybody have any questions on that? Gentlemen, do you want to, if you could come up and introduce yourselves? Yep.
Frank Campagna, Tri-State Associated Services. Just want to haze everything you kind of said. I hope that you find the presentation today and the whole commission, the presentation, to be fitting the description of what Hayes just described. We did tailor it to meet those needs. Today I'm with Steve McKenzie from McKenzie Architecture. He is we finally met face to face today, and Steve is a wealth of knowledge. So please, one of the things the developers wanted me to convey today was that we want to hear your questions. We want to learn from what you're interested in. Steve has reasons and explanations behind a lot of what you're going to see today, and I don't know what our timeline is, but you can kind of tap us and tell us we went too far when it gets too far, but we have a presentation that really covers a lot, and we're very, and I think I want to just say is that we're very excited about what we have to show you.
How much time do you think you need?
We're gonna read the room, I think is the best way to
Okay.
do this, and you could just tell us, because if the questions keep coming, I think you probably want answers to
All right.
them. So Brian, if you could just click through. So just to start off, I'm just gonna do a quick recap and then turn it over to Steve. I don't want to spend a lot of time on my end here, but the development team you're all familiar with is the Benor family, Benor Hospitality, the Herzogs, the Herzog Group, which is the Jordan family, and you may be less familiar with possibly with the Page family and Page Properties, if you know Page Lumber over in Poughkeepsie. So the interesting thing and the point I want to make to you is that these are generational developers, and what I mean by that is that they come from families that have been developing in the communities in which they live. That's an important fact, and it's almost like our ace in the hole, if you will, because it's the idea that they have another generation and generations that they're looking out for. Their reputation is very important to them. So when we have meetings like this, your input is important because they want to have people satisfied. We want the community to be satisfied. That's one of the messages they wanted to convey. There's also, you'll see here, a list of consultants that are listed there, and those consultants, you'll recognize the names because they're local. And that's another benefit of what we're bringing to the table, is that whenever possible, the expertise, if it's here locally, is going to get utilized. That means we're keeping dollars here locally in our community, which I think is very important. Next slide, please. Collaboration. So these are some of the organizations that the developers have been working with to date. It doesn't necessarily mean that everybody on this has agreed with everything that has happened. It's just that we're trying to express that there has been a practice of collaboration. This is part of that collaboration. Collaboration is important to us, and getting that feedback is important. Not every project can meet everybody's concern and every goal that's out there. This particular project had a set of goals that it was to address, and there's a listing here, and this screen is at the perfect distance where I can't read it so well, and I don't have it memorized. But I'm going to just say it's like the parking, as you know, was one of those objectives. Providing, boosting the commerce. Building our economic position here in Kingston was one of the objectives of this project. Again, not every objective can be met. No one single project can fulfill everybody's concern. We wish it could, but not everyone can. So this particular project is fulfilling the goals and objectives that was set in front of it. That was what I think is most important to keep in mind as we try to negotiate and come to an agreement as to where things should need to be. I think at this point in time, the next slide, Brian? Yeah, at this point in time, we have some beautiful renderings, which I don't think any of you have seen yet, and we're going to go to a PDF screen, and we'll come back to the PowerPoint. I'm going to let Steve take over here, because speaking to these PDFs really gives you a close, and we can zoom in, by the way, a close-up of where we're at right now architecturally and aesthetically with the project. Are you good, Steve? Yep. Okay.
Gonna stand up, probably works better. I do appreciate the opportunity to meet with all of you, and I hope this is more of a dialogue than a presentation on our part, because I'd like this to be interactive. So as you have questions, feel free to bring them up, because I think that'll be more productive and probably more useful in terms of time. So this is, I guess, maybe a little background about myself. I've been designing buildings for 47 years all over the country. So you can probably tell how old I probably am from that. Maybe not, if you're a good guesser. But in every project I think I've ever done, I've tried to relate to one of my favorite maxims, if you will, about architecture, which is everything should be designed in its next larger context. And the old saying is whether it's a chair in a room in a house, or a house within a certain neighborhood. And I think that's really always been a very important principle to try and adhere to. It's not always followed. I had the chance to visit Scotland back in 1986. One of the things that struck me about experiencing some of the architecture and some of the settings there is how buildings tend to take on kind of a background sort of presence. Is really more about the landscaping, which I really appreciated, because too often in this country and frankly other places, you see buildings competing for attention. To me, that's not really what it should be about. So buildings, in my mind, shouldn't necessarily, try to be billboards, or certainly simply about themselves. It's, again, fitting the context, fitting the environment. It's also the case that every project has to deal with many constraints. Frank touched on some of those. I welcome constraints, so you may have a few more to introduce tonight, and that's fine. It's still relatively early in the process. But another one of my favorite sayings is that the design process is like the way light refracts through a prism. So if you take a multicolored light band and refract it through the prism, you get a single color of white or yellow light. The design process is similar in that if we're not aware of the various constraints, they're not going to get refracted into the outcome. And obviously the timing of hearing about those constraints makes a big difference in the efficiency of the process. So again, I welcome the presence of constraints. We had many on this project. Some of them I'm sure you're familiar with, I won't spend a lot of time on, like of course building codes, accessibility, energy requirements, many things that are fundamental to how we approach any project. And many of those we frankly don't have a choice, especially when it comes to fire safety. But part of what we try to do is factor those in to some of the other aesthetic issues, including context, as I just touched on, the owner's agenda, and certainly the community agenda. And our challenge is to find a way to consolidate all of those, refact those, if you will, into an appropriate design solution. So what I'm going to show you tonight, I think hopefully many of you have seen already, but I'll try and give you a bit more insight into why and how we arrived at our particular solution for this circumstance. It's an unusual circumstance, as I'm sure you're well aware of. In a sense, you could characterize it as a bit schizophrenic, in that you have North Front Street and the historic setting on one side, and along Schwenk, it's a very different circumstance. And part of our challenge, of course, is to decide how to transition from one to the other. If we were literally, let's say, replicating both those circumstances, I'm not sure that would be an appropriate strategy. But that was very much part of our goal here, is to find an appropriate way to kind of bridge those two very different settings, aesthetically as well as functionally. Another is the reality that we're trying to accommodate a program requirement of 400 plus parking spaces. We know there's a need for that. That's very much part of the city's agenda, besides the owner's agenda, on top of what the city was asking for. So we didn't want that, obviously, to be the only driver, but part of what we tried to do is figure out a way to appropriately accommodate that, but not let that be the primary statement, or even be a significant statement. So I feel we accomplished that, and I'll talk about that more a bit later. So in terms of North Front Street side of the project, it became apparent that that certainly is the more important from an historic standpoint. You've seen, I think, some of the before and after views. We'll show that to you in a bit, in terms of how we've heard some feedback previously, listened to those comments, and factored those into the particular outcome. This view shows, for instance, some of the local buildings, some of the precedents we picked up on in terms of design cues. The Stuyvesant Hotel was one cue we felt was appropriate for the corner of North Front and Fair on the left-hand side of the view here for the new construction. The bay windows that you see are a reflection of a building on Wall Street that has a couple similar bay window expressions. We felt that in this case that fit what we're trying to do for this project. We transitioned from brick on the corner again of North Front and Fair to the original hotel, replicating that. I won't spend a lot of time again on why we decided to build new from the ground up, but suffice it to say that there's very little remaining of the original building there, and the obstacles in terms of codes and other constraints was such that it made much more sense to try and replicate the original. And having said that, we're trying to collect as much information as we can on, in fact, what was originally there. We have some photographs, nothing in terms of colors that were on the outside, so if you have anything to offer in that regard, it'd be much appreciated. What we've done here is show our notion of what was appropriate for the time by one of the individuals in our office who's done a fair amount of preservation work. So that's, you might say, a bit of another concept I often take into account when doing projects. We want to respect the historical context, but give it a modern sensibility. That's not as easy to do as it sounds. And we certainly don't want this to be approached with the notion of a theme park kind of mentality. Certainly there's got to be some authenticity in terms of how this is done. So I felt that's a very important aspect that factored very much in how we approach the design. That also shows you a view of Fair Street, how we created a public space. My sense in walking around town and so on is that something that would be valuable for this part of town, whether it's a gathering place. To me, it's important to have that as a public component. Part of my background in terms of historic structures, I actually live in two rather old buildings. One is in Burlington, where we have our office, where I live above the office. It's an 1869 vintage two-story Italianate brick building. Done a fair amount of restoration work on that. And I have to say, not only do I love the building, but I love the circumstance. So much of the culture, what we try to do in this type of setting is foster what I call a sustainable lifestyle, downsizing, foster a walkable circumstance. You certainly have those opportunities here, I think, in terms of what this project can do. In my own mind, that's very much an appropriate, call it historic, mindset for what should be accomplished here. And that's something that you currently don't have. If you truly think about the past 300 years for Kingston, clearly that was one aspect of, let's say, the quality of life or the circumstance for this component of town. So to me, this is an opportunity to get back to what that was for this portion of Kingston. So you jumped ahead of me, Brian, there, but that's okay. So this shows the other side of the project, and you can see how this reflects some of the challenges we were dealing with in terms of the scale. We recognize that in terms of concealing a 400-car parking facility with the appropriate ratio of housing and some of the other uses, that it does present some challenges. So we felt that the appropriate approach was to conceal the parking on this part of the site, which is really Brad Jordan's part of it. You see the housing on top of, again, a 4-story parking structure. I'm a big fan of introducing landscaping as an element and using that to the extent possible. So for the base of the building on this side of the street, we're showing in this case river birch that provides a very nice landscape screen for the base of the building rather than simply seeing an exposed facade for the parking structure. And that's true also on the other side of the street. Above that, what we've done, and this is to some extent a function of the budget because that's a reality as far as our constraints for the project. We're spending the money where it matters more on North Front Street with the brick, the use of stone, limestone for some of the trim on the building. And on the other sides where, let's say, it's less critical in terms of the historic context, we're using a different palette, but we're still using several elements in our design kit to make this sympathetic in terms of the fenestration. We're using material and color and volumes to articulate something that looks like a cluster of smaller buildings. You can probably see that better from the next slide too, I think, Brian, or maybe the one after. So whether it's this side of the project or the North Front Street side of the project, when you reference the standards for historic preservation, the national standards, one of the things they talk about in this kind of project, which is not a restoration, but it is new construction in an historic context, is respecting the context in terms of material, color, scale, character, and similar types of elements. So that's what we tried to do in terms of all aspects of the building, is think in terms of those components. So the fenestration, the proportions on the windows very much pick up on the balance of the stockade district. We used the cornice component, again, as respecting some of the details you see. The articulation of the volumes that you see here is very similar if you look down Wall Street or Front Street, similar to the scale of many of the buildings that are still in existence in those parts of the district. Along Schwenk also, we have a 4-story building. It's actually 3 stories, I take that back, that conceals the north side of the parking structure. Again, I think we'd all much rather see that sort of expression than a 4-story parking structure for how that would come off. So that's actually a building that has a single loaded quarter. The quarter's on the backside against the parking structure. So when you drive down Schwenk from either direction, what you'll see and experience is a 4-story building. And again, we're using a palette of materials and opening sizes, but using the color to articulate, as I said, what looks like a cluster of buildings, rather than something that's simply a monolith in terms of the expression, which would only exaggerate the scale of how this fits in. On top of that, you can see where the building steps back, and the step back is about 35 feet from the top of the cornice along Schwenk to the facade set back.
Could you point that out?
Yeah, it's a little hard to see from this view, but so this is the 3-story version along Schwenk.
Steve, what's parking garage? So just
Parking garage is behind this portion here,
a
okay?
4-story, okay.
This portion sits on top of the parking structure, okay? So in reality, we're designing what I consider, and from a code standpoint, is truly a 4-story wood building that's being used to conceal a 4-level parking structure, a 3-level parking structure, and some commercial. So that's one of our challenges in reconciling, again, some of the constraints we have to deal with, whether it's budget or whether it's program or whether it's some of the site or contextual constraints. So does that make sense, what I just said? This is a 3-story building. This is set back a considerable distance from that facade. If you have time for it, we have a video we could show you. Have some of you seen the video shown earlier at some of the meetings, the Planning Commission? That actually gives you a better sense of the scale and the massing for all of this, because some of these only give you a partial sense of how that works.
Is there a way to open up more of the elevation on the bottom 4 stories that are parking that doesn't make this all seem quite so monolithic from this facade?
Sure. In fact, we may do that anyway to, it's not going to lower the height or scale of the volume, but certainly we can open that up. One of the things we thought about, Hayes, was using a trellis kind of effect over the base of the parking structure. So again, it's a landscaping effect, not the building effect. To me, having the landscaping mitigates, especially that one point of view, the scale of the building. And frankly, that's very much part of our agenda anyways, find opportunities to introduce greenery, whether you think of it from a sustainability standpoint or simply an aesthetic standpoint. Sure.
Where is the actual entrance to the parking garage?
So you drive up Fair Street at the intersection of Schwenk and Fair, where it currently exists, and you know that's a fairly significant slope. You know, that represents the original bluff for the edge of the Stockade District. So the entry is about halfway up.
Oh, it's on the hill going
Yep.
on the right.
Yep. So the way we set up the building is we said North Front Street is kind of a reference elevation for the ground level. That's where we have retail in the base of the building. There's some common elements for the residents, the housing residents, like you've probably seen the pool deck, amenities, there'll be a fitness center, things like that. That's true on both sides of Fair Street. So about halfway up, if you think of the current circumstance, you'll make a right turn into the 3-story parking structure, which will house 400 cars. They'll actually be parking, excuse me, on both sides of Fair, parking under the buildings both sides of the street to get to the 400 total. 250 of those, as I understand it, are to satisfy the city's requirement for parking, and the other 150 nominal are for the housing and for the hotel. And our thought in terms of the hotel was, I believe we said about a 40-room, if I remember correctly. I could be wrong about that, but I think that's in the record, and about 130 housing units.
There's no parking when you're going up Fair on the hotel side.
Yes, there is. It's on both sides.
It's on both
It's on both sides. So when you look at, if you go back to the previous view, Brian, so that's the other side of Fair. You can see again, just to the left of the pedestrian bridge, that's Fair Street, where you go up. So under both buildings, there's 3 levels of parking. Under both parking uses, there's a 4-story structure of housing. The ground floor of that 4-story structure is a commercial use, where it has frontage on either North Front Street or on Fair Street. And then the upper portion of Fair Street, if you think of taking the high end of Fair Street and pivoting to create a level surface, that's now a pedestrian plaza. And that probably shows it a little more clearly if you can see that board. What was your name again, by the way?
Oh, I'm Mike.
Mike.
Priori.
Okay. So this actually is the view looking up.
Is that in a good place where you can see it?
Yeah, looking up Fair Street. Can you see that? Okay. So, and again, in our minds, we're trying to minimize the role of the car in dictating the built environment. That's been a big part of my agenda. For any building type that I've done a lot of hospitals, which are like designing small cities. That's a whole nother subject. So to me, one of the benefits of the project is taking traffic and parking out of the Stockade District and giving the city an opportunity to do more if they so desire. And that's a whole nother subject as well, whether you think of what pedestrian-oriented means, can mean many different things, but to me it starts with reducing the role of the car, reducing the dependence on the car. The other benefit of this, I think, as you know intuitively, is by introducing housing, you're creating a circumstance that's walkable where somebody can live here and walk to wherever they work, not have to drive or ride a bike. I live above my office, so obviously that's ideal, but I used to commute 5 miles on an electric bike before I moved above where my office is. So to me, anything I can do to encourage that lifestyle is a good thing. And anything we could do architecturally to facilitate that is a good thing. So you can see how the blend of uses and the site circumstance dictate certain things in terms of how you approach the scale of the project. And it's a fact of life that whether we had frontage on Schwenk or the building was sold all the way back, even if you look at the prior views of, I think, the Montgomery Ward building, whatever, you had a very tall blank facade, a blank brick facade, and a parking lot next to it. And that's certainly an unattractive edge to present, if you will, to the general public or for the city to deal with.
And in that rendering there along Schwenk, what's on the sidewalk level there? I mean,
I'd like to
again,
see.
I can study them closer.
Yeah, I'd like to see as much greenery. That's not part of our domain. I think that's the city's domain. But again, to me, that's an opportunity for whatever we can do as far as landscaping. The sidewalk there is pretty generous. I think it's a 10-foot wide sidewalk along Schwenk. The units are elevated there because no one wants to live where you're right at sidewalk and everybody walking by can look in your window. That's not
So is that a
desirable.
limestone base or what
You know,
is that long
it's
gray
a
line?
cementitious material. We haven't finalized yet. It'll have that type of look. It could look like limestone, but it's some type of cementitious product. And that's actually the edge of the parking where it comes under the housing above that pokes out below those 3 stories of housing. So,
Steve, the balconies on the parking portion of this, are those just fake? I mean, what?
on the parking portion, they're all real balconies. Those are all housing units that you're seeing there with their balconies. So every one of those.
So housing, so units are going to front the parking?
Yes. So
Okay.
this, the parking's completely tucked into the existing slope. And rather than have more parking that comes all the way out to the edge of Swank, let alone a taller parking structure, we're hiding that with a 3-story building. Okay? And then this building is completely offset from a 3-story building here. So when you're driving or walking along Schwenk, you won't even see this. And that's exactly what we're trying to accomplish. That's an important way to minimize the impact of the scale of this project. We recognize that it's a challenge in terms of what else exists around this part of Kingston. There's no question that this is something different. But it's a reflection of many different agendas, and we feel it's a good balance of all those different considerations. We feel strongly that if there's any place we spend money, and money's always a constraint, it's along North Front Street. And that's why we're using the brick, the limestone, and some other refinements in terms of the cornice treatment. So, okay, does that help?
Well, one last question, and
Sure.
I don't want to dwell on it any longer.
Yep.
What's the height of that base going along Schwenk?
4 to 4, I think we have about 11 feet, so we can have a
So
decent.
that gray line would be.
That's probably about, yeah, it's about 4 or 5 feet high.
That's 4 or 5 feet high.
Yeah, I think there's a pedestrian shown here. That may change because we're exploring some different structural systems for the parking. If we can compress the floor to floor, that might reduce that a bit. We'll just have to see.
Are there any yards tucked in there, or the building comes right up to that?
It comes right up to pretty close to the property line, but everybody has a balcony. You know, I think an outdoor opportunity is important for everybody, fresh air, daylight, et cetera. Those are fundamental needs. So they'll have a private space besides the common terrace, which you see in a later on view on the inside of the plan. Okay? Any other questions before I keep going?
Just on the first slide,
Sure.
the north front view, next to the bay windows, there's the white trim windows. I really can't tell what style they're, they.
On this view?
Yeah, because just from the distance, they kind of look very institutional, but I.
Which one are you thinking of? The bay windows?
Between the bay windows and the corner. It
Okay.
Just,
What is
without
that
being
material?
blown up, yeah, that looks a little bit better.
It'll probably be stone, we're thinking, because that's more consistent. So that's.
I couldn't tell if they were painted or not. That's
Yeah, I think we had them labeled in some of the materials we gave to the city, but I'm thinking stone, just like you would for any type of punched opening in a historic context. The bay windows will be metal. We're thinking of black frames on the windows for how we approach those. The brick, I'm thinking something that's, a hand struck, something that's got in a regular shape, but there's many different ways we can go on that. Notice that you do have a lot of painted brick buildings in town, so that's probably a function of the age as well as the type of brick. Some types of brick are meant to be painted. So I don't want to do that though with what we're building here, but it's certainly a consideration. Any questions, by the way, on the hotel side of things? I won't spend a lot of time on it.
I do have a couple of questions on that. What
Sure.
drove the decision to sort of, in your own words, replicate the existing building as opposed to just trying something completely different, but that would sort of fit the context of the historic district, but maybe be a little more ambitious or something?
Yeah, I think for better, for worse, because there was, call it a ghost of the building there, the volume, but that sort of planted in our minds the value of at least considering restoring it, and we discovered later in the process that there's not a lot, frankly, left of the original building.
Pay homage maybe and fit with the civic council and other surroundings, but it wasn't necessarily a replica, so to speak, of.
And that's an interesting suggestion. You know, I guess I'm going back to a comment made earlier. When you look at the standards, if you're building something totally new, they say please respect, the scale of penetration, materials, etc. I didn't really think that would be the case here. I truly thought we were restoring this, and recreating it, if you will, to the extent we can be true to the original. So I think it fits. I sense there's some appeal historically of having that if it all was good preserved, you know. So I don't feel that same way about the Montgomery Ward building, not that it is there for sure anyway, but to me that, you know, didn't offer the same.
And what's the facade material on that? I never, from the renderings, I never came.
The original was flat sided, so that your intent is to replicate the original, at least as far as the aesthetic. And it works for the intended use, because what we're thinking is a boutique type hotel, and I think that sort of personality very much fits with what that should be. So, you know, you could probably portray that in a number of ways, but it just made sense to us. We hadn't talked about much otherwise as far as totally something new, but I like how that fits in. And in its own way, that the height of that likewise sort of indicated the fact that we have a four-story building on the other side. To me, that frames the public space, frames the view in a nice way down Fair Street. Any other questions before we keep going? Okay. I do have, there's a lot to talk about. I don't know how much you want to hear, but yeah, I don't want to take up too much time, but there's one thing I wanted to mention about the pedestrian plaza, Brian, if you find a view of that from North Front Street. Maybe going back. Yeah. We have gotten some really good feedback from some residents on the HLEC as part of the conference call with them in last fall, if I remember correctly. I could be wrong. I don't remember who mentioned it, but one of the members made a comment about how nice it would be for somebody to reference the original stockade location as part of what we did on the site. You know, not that it's there now as far as I'm aware, but he mentioned maybe having something in the pavement, for instance, that reflected the original location of residence. One idea we were thinking about, I haven't actually talked about this with the client, but I think with the interactive water fountain, it could be a way we could create a pattern with the fountain to replicate the location and some of that impact, if you will. So something to think about. But that's an example where we welcome comments, welcome input. Goes back to what I said at the beginning about if we're not aware of, I'll call it a constraint, but there's other ways you can characterize it. Call it an idea, if you will. But that's one example of someone's comment that we're able to retract possibly into part of the outcome. So again, that's important for us to hear whatever you have to say or suggest or think. Other views want to go around the other side, Brian, maybe the amenity area. I think otherwise I covered most of the key points. I wasn't going to talk about other ways in which you responded. One was going again to, for the entrance to the park construction. This is what you see from Wall Street as you approach the site. So that's a one-way access down to the parking facility. Again, another way to help offload some of the traffic and parking on this part of town. But another one of the comments we also heard about, if you can find the slide, Brian. I'll give you a quick tour here. Okay, that's, I think outdoor space is a very important component of how buildings are designed. To me, buildings shape outdoor rooms the same way that rooms shape buildings. So whether it's the Common Plaza or something like this for the residents, again, I think it's important to make that part of how you approach urban planning. I do think that will be available also for the hotel guests as well as an amenity space. So it's got a nice orientation to the west. Other questions, comments, thoughts? Okay.
Are floor plans available for?
Yeah, we have 4 plans, sure. Yeah.
We can make them available on the website.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Kevin? It seems to me, Steve, I think some of the public grappling with this is around the fact that it seems like usually you have three very distinct things going on. You've got the clapboard sort of North Front Street elevation of the hotel. You've got the red brick elevation of the apartments. And then at the back on the Shin Drive, you've got this sort of more contemporary look going on. Is part of the reason there that sort of three different styles sort of breaks up the massing, or what was sort of your thought process there?
Well, it does break up the massing, and the articulation is one of the best tools we have to do that. Again, if you walk down Wall Street, you'll see a pretty wide variety of building heights, expression, color, materials. I should say a lot of brick, but it's painted in different colors. So I felt in that regard, this is sympathetic to what you see when you walk around those parts of town. It's not the case that you have uniformity. You have quite a bit of variety in many ways for the building. So that was part of how we rationalize it. You know, it still comes back to your intuitive comfort level, but we did feel it was appropriate for that reason. Because frankly, Wall Street and North Front do give you a lot of opportunities for what you want to reference as far as the building. You know, we picked a couple of things. Sites, and again, I mentioned three over Wall Street, but there's certainly many others you could reference. But that risk becoming chaos, obviously.
But you think there's got to be a way to make it sort of coherent, a coherent whole in terms of some visual cues or design?
Yeah, it probably looks less so because we purposely, like I said, make it look like a cluster of smaller buildings. We've done that by how we vary the color and, let's say, they're type of siding, even though it's probably going to be something like hardy panel, but they make a variety of products, whether it's board and batten or clapboard. So what you're seeing on these views is mixing up, again, the application of those products, the color, location for the palette. We have looked at other color options, colors. Always a tough one. Everybody has a very subjective notion of what colors they like and don't like. My wife and I don't agree on colors. Most of the time, I should say we agree, not always.
You've used a lot of these elements, a lot of these materials in the project.
Yes.
Can you share with the commission at some point photos of those existing projects and how it's set up over time? The materials, just the way they look in real life. I realize it's not an exact copy, but
So there's a hotel we did up in Saratoga Springs called Pavilion Grand. I think that's been open for about 6-7 years, something like that. It's on Lake Avenue, downtown Saratoga Springs. And it's a boutique hotel. It went through initial evolution design phases, but it's a very exterior, commercial on the ground floor, has a restaurant, etc. Similar to some of the things we do here.
what's the name of it again?
Pavilion Brand. They have a website, online, nice website. They have roof terraces and other nice elements, so that's probably a good reference. Another project we did for the same client, Joe Panura, in Poughkeepsie, that has hardy panel on it, that was completed, I think, about 2 years ago, the water club. So it's a very different design expression, you know, much more contemporary, but that's the same product as far as being, it's a hardy panel product, not the same type of siding we're contemplating here. So the trim would be hardy because that's a stable, durable, fireproof product. And relatively good in terms of maintenance.
I had seen an earlier rendering of the parking entrance on North Front Street that was arched.
Yes.
It's now been changed to the
It's now changed to this, because that was some of the feedback we got, I forget from who, it was actually from the owner, preferred horizontal And that's fine, you know, I think that works. I had the encouragement, it was a Richard Zoning reference, I know you got some buildings in town that reference that style of architecture, be decent materials, so that was something thinking. And I try to get like a strong visual cue. When people are driving a car and making a decision, I want it to be a clear and easy choice. I don't want somebody guessing where the entrance is to park, especially in that circumstance on Wall Street or North Front. And I think that the horizontal still works fine, it won't be quite as compelling, but, you know, those things are important for wayfinding.
With some of these other projects, particularly these large-scale mixed-use developments like this, has it been your experience that most cities have had an independent architectural review process in place as part of this?
No, I haven't, can't say I haven't encountered that or the design review committees. Sometimes there's an architect on some of those committees, but I've never done it with a third party, if you will, doing some sort of review.
Other questions from the commissioners? Staff members?
Have you seen the video of the project? I thought that had shown, but it's on the website. I don't know if we have time for that or not. It's 2-minute video.
If we have to sort.
It probably gives you a little better overview of the scale of the project because it's a fly around with the different sites. It's an earlier version of the design, so it's a different color palette. But, you know, it gives you a sense of the scale. You blow that up. I hear the music, but I don't see anything else. Am I good? That was the key. So no other questions, thoughts, comments? Do I need to review any of the visual impact boards you've seen all those, the before and after shots? Different vantage points of the time. I think we got that one over there. Okay, here we go. So it doesn't play the music correctly. So that's approaching on Fair Street. So I think the pedestrian plaza is a great opportunity for all kinds of events. And some of that will depend on what type of commercial establishments are located on the ground level, but to me that's a great opportunity. That skylight you see is daylight. That's down one floor at the arrival point when you enter the parking structure, so you see an illuminated source as you drive in and out through the upper part of the plaza. So we didn't do that as part of the drive-through, but again, that introduces daylight down as kind of a, let's say, a backdrop as you come into that parking entry. There's a drop-off down there for the hotel. This is, again, an earlier model of the project along North Front Street. We modified the ground level windows. That was one of the comments from the HLPC to be more typical of some of the retail around town.
They wanted windows trying to be smaller.
No, they wanted the larger openings, which is what we did on the street level.
So I couldn't hear.
Larger window openings. Yeah. As you see right there, yeah.
So this is the new one. This is how it's.
Yeah, the only thing that is different from the most recent version is the opening to the parking garage. And you'll see the color palette on the housing portions is different. This is an earlier version of color palette. Shows green.
Steve, where do you anticipate the traffic that used to go down that road? Where is that? have there been studies to see where that traffic is
Yeah,
going
the
to go?
traffic studies done, and those concluded there was minimal impact in terms of closing the street. And I would hope that most people coming in the car would use Schwenk. And if this now becomes, the parking destination to me, that's a plus, so that you don't have traffic on North Front Street and other parts of the Stockade District, And I can't say I certainly have the experience of the whole what it is to contend with, but it can only help offload a lot of that, as well as improve the convenience for people coming here to shop or have a meal or whatever, so.
That study is available online, and if anyone wants a paper copy, I have one copy.
Pardon? Oh, yeah. This is Dennis Arias, the civil engineer for the project. I'm sure most of you know Dennis. Do you have any questions you want to answer, Dennis?
No, just on traffic, Creighton Manning from Albany did a study that was requested by the planning board as lead agency, and that is online on the city website, but it's also here, which answered a lot of the questions you just asked. A lot of boring detail.
Okay.
Any other questions or issues anyone wants to express? Again, I don't think we're going to be, I think we need to take some time to get an advisory opinion on this, and we don't have to do that until next month to have a potential secret determination. So, thank you, gentlemen.
Yep. Thank you. Appreciate the opportunity. Let us know if there are questions.
Okay.
And, yeah, right. I just want to say is that if there's anything additional that you need, you can just obviously reach out, and the developers will provide whatever they can to satisfy that. We do have more than what we showed here today that we can make available to you. We can do that through the website as well, kingstonianny.com.
So any questions should be funneled to Julie and Sue. We'll get back to you.
Will the PowerPoint presentation be made available to the commissioners?
We'll make sure that that's on the website as well.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You want this off? Please.
Next item of business is 33 North House